Okay, welcome back everyone, and welcome to the final session of the day. So this is the inclusive and interactive education session that I mentioned earlier. Excuse me. So yeah, this is entitled Creating Inclusive Education Sessions for Para-Athletes and Athlete Support Personnel. But the focus is going to be very much on an interactive session. So what's important is we try and sort of form slightly larger groups. So if across our tables, obviously some people have already got 5 or 6 people on the table, but if you're in sort of 2s and 3s, it might be useful to combine into other tables, and I think the session will work better if we do that. But yeah, so we've got Dr. Liz Carlin, we've got Gemma back helping out in this session as well, but also Paul Moss and Paula Donovan, 2 of our NADO partners contributing to this session as well. So over to you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks Ian, Thanks everybody, thanks for still being around, and hopefully we'll get quite a bit all together out of this session. The aim of this session is very much about learning from each other. It's not going to be a session where I'm just telling you how to provide an interactive and inclusive education session, simply because we have an absolute wealth of knowledge in this room, and I think we need to make sure that we use that knowledge that we have so that we can all understand different experiences. We have athletes, we have athlete support personnel, we have educators, academics, we have everybody in the room. So the aim is to get together and actually start to use some of that experience to share best practice, basically. So throughout the session, I think one of the important things to start off with is we're going to hear a bit about Gemma's story, Gemma's experiences of education and receiving education through different contexts and delivering education as well. As she does for Scottish Disability Sport amongst many others. And then it's going to be over to you guys. We're going to present some case studies. You're receiving some of them now on the tables. And we'll start to then have a discussion with those in your groups. Hopefully the technology holds strong. Hopefully it works, and if it does, you'll be able to feed back directly onto a Padlet that we can have on screen. So we'll go through that all as we go through the session anyway. But first of all, I'll pass to Gemma to tell us a bit about Gemma's story.
To grab the microphone from this is here with.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. So really excited to be here at the conference today. You've obviously already heard from me, but I just thought to sort of put the workshop into perspective. I'll tell you a little bit about my sort of experiences. My story and how sort of I found the UCAD education, and just a few little things that I've picked up from, I guess, my time as an athlete, but just as someone living with a disability myself. So as said before, I'm a wheelchair rugby player. I've been involved in sport since I was 3 years. Started off doing it as like physiotherapy, and then sort of joined in with team sports and really found the benefit of that. It really gave me a sense of belonging. It really helped to increase my confidence, and it really helped me to accept my disability, as when I was growing up it was quite challenging for me living with a disability. So that's sort of how I got involved in sport. And in terms of, I guess, my educational experiences, throughout my life, I guess I've had highs and lows in terms of different inclusive practice. So I think when I was younger, I think there was a lot less sort of awareness around inclusion and disability. So thinking back to school and PE lessons, I sort of got told to sort of sit at the side and take score. That sort of thing, or teachers wouldn't quite know how to adapt and include sessions, and even sort of within a school environment, things like writing and things like that were quite challenging for me, and there wasn't really that understanding about that. But I think because I was young, and this is one of my key takeaways, and if you're going to take anything from this session, this would be one of the things to take away, is people didn't assume to ask me first. They didn't ask me what the best adaptations would be, what I can and can't do. They either went to ask my parents, or they just made assumptions themselves. And I think that's one of the key things is actually the individual with a disability, they know themselves the best. They often will know what works for them and what doesn't, and sometimes it's about having those difficult conversations. I think it was Pippa that said 65% of people were sort of nervous around having a conversation. I think that is key to sort of creating that inclusive environment, is talking to the participants. In terms of my UCAD experience overall, it's been really positive. I've had so many UCAD presentations, I can't even count, from sort of since I was 16 till now at 24. I think they've been really sort of positive in terms of the way that they're delivered, and lots of sort of interesting content. Obviously, I said before, I think one of my key questions, or my key sort of adaptations that I think I had after the sessions were, what happens if you have a disability, which means, you can't do the samples yourself, or, you need to get more support. And I think that's something that I sort of took away to try and find out a little bit more. And I think that's where, again, the discussions sort of come in. And when I've been working, so with my role as a tutor, I speak to teachers, coaches, volunteers, everything like that. Just loads of people that work with different people with disabilities sort of across the sector. And I think one of the key messages for me is about sort of adapting and thinking outside the box, but also just using common sense. It sounds silly, but people think, this person has a disability, we're going to have to do something crazy to adapt it. We're really going to have to, but actually, it might just be something really simple. So, for example, if you're in a workshop and, you've got someone, I'm going to give away the case study here, so I won't say that bit, but just sometimes it's about just small changes, like increasing the time, or just little things that you would think about doing for anyone if you were coaching or teaching people of a variety of ages. It's exactly the same, and I think we need to get out of our heads around disability being this sort of scary word, and think about it being more inclusive, sort of like inclusive in terms of age, inclusive in terms of gender. Inclusive education is exactly the same. You'd make the same sort of adjustments if you had a 14-year-old and a 6-year-old. You would adapt to that. So I think that's something for me that is really key. Don't overthink it, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because sometimes you have teachers and people, they're too afraid to ask because they're too scared to say the wrong thing. And I think by not asking, then you do end up getting yourself in a sticky situation. So hopefully that is helpful, just to put a bit of context into what we're doing. And I know that we've got Ali and we've got Lizette here, who obviously have disabilities themselves, who've probably got a wealth of experience. I'm sure we'll be asking you to share some thoughts later on. So please don't be afraid to sort of come up to us and ask for advice, or just if there's something that you would have want to ask but you've been too nervous. We're the perfect guinea pigs, basically. So go for it. So yeah, we'll just carry on with the
perfect.
session.
And I think one of the things that Gemma mentioned there, and something that's been mentioned quite a lot today, is the athlete's voice. And that links quite nicely into the first case study. So regardless of what page you have, the top section of it is what we're looking at now. So this is looking at the athlete's voice. How are we going to ensure that we actually hear it, especially if that athlete has perhaps some issues in terms of their verbalization? So the example we're given is around an athlete with cerebral palsy, which impacts their speech, and they've attended one of your training sessions. So have a bit of a chat in your groups. The QR codes, do this as you feel like you can do it. So either have multiple people at your table scan the QR code and you can all feedback on it, or you can have one person that can do it for the whole group. Or indeed, if the QR codes aren't working for you, which they were, so hopefully it stays okay. But we can also obviously take it verbally at the end as well. So use the prompts on the page simply as prompts. We want to hear your experiences. We want to hear how have you perhaps done this in the past to ensure that you can hear the athlete's voice. What experiences do you have been on the receiving end of education in that sense? So let's start to share those experiences. That's one of the conversations that I've been having with a lot of people today about this session. They've been saying, oh, I'm really interested to hear and learn from you. It's not about learning from me. It's not about learning from Gemma. It's learning from everybody else in the room as well. So let's use that time to share the experiences. So we'll give a few minutes and we'll start to see what's coming through then on the Padlet.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and they got me.
Okay, guys, I think there's been quite a few things coming through on that and some really interesting discussions at the tables that I moved around as well. So it's great to see. Is there anybody in particular that wants to share the discussion that you were having? Just for a minute or two before we move on. We will be saving these Padlets so that everybody can get access to them afterwards as well. So that will be getting saved and shared. So anybody want to kick us off with a discussion on some of the points you raised or spoke about?
So I've last year conducted some research into dual career para support experiences that did include athletes who have cerebral palsy and who were really keen to take part, but they expressed to me they were quite concerned about being physically exhausted during the interviews because I needed them to be about an hour long. So they said, I really want to take part, I've got some really good things to say, but I can only do max 15 minutes. So I said, would you be able to do 3 15-minute sessions? And they said yes and preferred to split the sessions down into smaller ones so they were able to convey what they wanted to say without being physically exhausted or overwhelmed. And one person raised that to me, and then 3 or 4 other cerebral palsy athletes then said, actually that's a really good idea, I want to take part now. So it kind of took one person to speak up and say how things can help, and it snowballed, and then allowed the research to be better anyway. So we spoke about that.
Absolutely. Fatigue is definitely an issue, and I suppose a lot of us have probably seen that over this past couple of years working on screen fatigue, and it's a very similar point and something that's really important to consider for a number of different types of impairments and disabilities. So that's a great point. I had actually spotted that on the screen, and one of the ones that I picked out as being something extremely useful. Anybody else? I know there was some really interesting discussions around the resources in advance and what we do in advance of sessions. Somebody want to share what you were speaking about around that?
Okay. We were just talking about how, trying to understand their needs in advance. If you circulate the resources, then they might be able to respond and say, oh, can I have that in this format, or something else that makes it more accessible to me. So not just assuming if you turn up on the day and give out a pamphlet that that's going to work for every individual.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a discussion we've had quite a bit over the last number of weeks at UCAD in terms of the getting that information in advance, and I know this table spoke quite a bit about that as well. And it's about those questions that we ask and how we frame those questions. Because what sort of response do we often get if we just simply ask the question, do you need anything in advance? A lot of shakes of the head. It's quite often, no, it's all good. And that's what, sorry, I can't remember your name. Dave. It's what Dave was sharing in the group around somebody had just told you no, they didn't need anything, whereas you found out they needed quite a bit. So yes, absolutely. And what you'll see, and what I've seen from reading some of the things that are on screen there, is none of these changes are massive changes that we have to make. It's just how we frame the question in advance to ensure that we have the information that we need. And that's what you'll see through a lot of the case studies that we'll look at. So we'll move on just in terms of timing. But like I say, we'll be saving these and making sure that they're made available to everybody afterwards as well. So on your desks now, so on the same sheet, the bottom one is what you're going to work on now. So it's a slightly different case study, and each table is going to be working on something slightly different. Again, it has some questions that are some prompts. But use this in the way they're just prompts. You don't have to strictly answer the questions. Share your experiences, share your knowledge, so that we can all take points from that. So it's the second QR code that you have and the different points that you have on it. And we'll change screens for that. So I'll also scroll through the different case studies on the slides here so that you can see what some of the other tables are doing as well. So what you'll see is your Padlet screen will now look slightly different. There's the section for each of the case studies, so look at the case study number that you have and add your points to that one. Okay, so we'll start to bring it all together. We're trying to bring the time back a bit. So let's have a look at Padlet. So starting to get some points coming through here on all of them, which is great. So we had a few different case studies there. We had an athlete with a visual impairment, an athlete with a hearing impairment, we had an athlete with an intellectual disability, and we had an athlete with dyslexia. Depending on the definitions that you read, you'll read some definitions that class dyslexia as a disability and some class it as a learning difficulty. So it's still something we need to consider regardless of how it's classified, but we'll not go back into a classification discussion. So who at what table? Give me a couple of points that you were talking about and tell me what case study they referred to for you. So give me an idea of what you were discussing within your groups. Any group in particular want to venture first?
So our case study was case study 2 around intellectual disability, and we just explored things like using the right language and making sure that we're not maybe using a tone of voice or a tone of language, like easy read mode language. But on the flip side, also balancing that with not going too low of language, making sure you're not ending up being perceived as quite condescending or patronising, just making sure that tone is right. Similar to the other case study, we spoke around perhaps contacting them beforehand just to check in with themselves, because we all admitted along the table that intellectual disability can have a wide range, and not to sort of preconceive their level, try and have that communication with them beforehand. And then we also explored the use of like post sessions, so maybe doing follow-up sessions, not just with the disabled participant, but with the whole session, by checking and challenging and like recapping learning, maybe signposting to extended versions of extra learning, and being a facilitator that's there outside of just the designated workshop time, for whatever that looks like for the attendees.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that links into that as well is then, so our actual delivery of it. We are now finally back at the stage where a number of our sessions are becoming face-to-face again. So we can start to adapt the way we actually deliver. So it doesn't have to be just everything on a slide that we have to talk through. Hopefully, we like to move away from the idea of chalk and talk these days. and become more interactive. So having that information in advance of what that athlete requires and what suits their way of learning is definitely something really important. I think it links well to what was discussed beforehand around the short sessions. For that athlete in particular might work really well. But Lizette, you're looking to come in with something? Paul has a mic there for you.
Yes, so if you have some slides, I think it's ideal to send it before the education. So then the visual impaired person can read it on their own screen with the screen reader. And then you have also the slides for the visual impaired person.
Screen readers are something that's really interesting, and I would love to hear your perspective on it. Because we all design slides in very different ways. But does that always work with screen readers?
And most of the time, PDF doesn't work. PowerPoint is better, but it's also different what kind of screen readers people use. But if it doesn't work, the visual impaired person can translate it to another kind of document after the session. So you have always more information than you didn't send it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those where providing something is better than providing nothing. Do you have anything else from your perspective, Lizette, that you think we need to be considering as people delivering education?
Wendy said to me that if we have in real-time education, then she brings the stuff to the education room. So I think that's a good idea for now blind athletes. They can feel the stuff for the doping control, and other people can see it and knows about it. I think that's a good idea.
Okay, so bring in some of the, for example, testing equipment with you?
Yes.
The likes of the pots?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Love that idea. So actually having something very tactile that you can then start to get an understanding of what it will be like to select the testing vessels and things like that. So yeah, that's a great point as well. Was this table looking at any of the other case studies as well, or was there any points that you considered? No? So what about, so we've thought a bit about the athlete with a visual impairment, the athlete with intellectual impairment. With this table, we're looking at the athletes with hearing impairments and what sort of things were being discussed at this table.
We're thinking about somebody that had experience with like sign language, but then you mentioned about how different it is, which made it quite challenging.
Yeah, I threw a bit of a spanner
Yeah,
in the
I was
works
like,
for
oh
that
my
one, didn't I?
Obviously, the common one is to make sure that the subtitle platform used for videos is accurate, because obviously we know that with other platforms they can vary. So yeah, that's what we discussed. I didn't realise that with sign language it's different. So actually, I've learned something today. Thank you.
Yeah, and so yeah, Wendy, I'll come with the mic.
Well, I gave some education sessions for those people, and there was just at the education sessions there was someone, they made like real life like the subtitles. So they are just on the screen, just above my presentation. They just can read what I was saying. So I was just look like, oh, wow, this is cool that this can be done just in real time subtitles.
Real-time subtitles, anybody that can actually provide those, the speed that they can type at to do that is unbelievable. But just on the point, what we had talked about in terms of sign language is even that recognition that sign language in itself is a language. So the person that you're working with, English isn't their first language, or Dutch isn't their first language, or whatever country you're in, their first language is sign language in their country. But specifically here in the UK, we like to make things even more complicated in that sign language in Scotland is slightly different from sign language in England, it's slightly different from sign language in Wales, and slightly different from sign language in Northern Ireland, and then Ireland as well is different again. So it might be that if we're working at a national level, particularly within the UK, we could end up having to have multiple sign language interpreters at a session. But we won't know that if we don't have that information in advance. So hopefully, I'm just very conscious of the time. We're trying to sort of catch time up a bit again. So it's been a very, very short whirlwind tour of some of the areas that we've been talking about. But hopefully it starts to give people a bit of an idea of some of the adaptations that we can make and some of the things that we can do. We have a few more kind of tips and things to remember on the slides themselves, which I will show just very briefly. So it might be, well, what do we need to consider pre-session? So encouraging the sharing of information in advance, getting those supporting documents, pre-reading in alternative formats. What you'll notice, so the pages that are on the desks or on the tables for you all are all printed on cream paper, simply in case anybody is sitting at a table and has dyslexia. Therefore, white is a very poor background or a very difficult background to read, whereas pastel sort of colours are the go-to, or something that makes it a lot easier to read. So I know what we've started doing at UCAD based on some of these discussions is we've created an alternative slide deck in more pastel colours to make it easier to read, that can be provided to people in advance. Some things in terms of the aesthetics of the slides themselves, having it very uncluttered, strong contrasts in terms of the background, so light text on dark backgrounds, dark text on light backgrounds, thinking about the font size, the colour. Generally, the type of font can make quite a big difference. And then if you have, if you're using images, have an alternative text on images so that things like screen readers can pick up that alternative text. And then considering the flow of those slides for screen reader use as well. We all design slides in very different ways, and the text can be a bit everywhere, which then doesn't necessarily fit with some of the screen readers. So it is a very, very whirlwind tour, and all the points that have come through on the Padlet, we will make them available, so that, as I say, everybody can share those experiences and share those thoughts amongst each other as well. But does anybody have any questions or any points that you think we still need to consider?
I just have one there, Liz. Like, I find, and this is just personally, that I find that I try to almost become an expert in anti-doping and nearly forget about the education piece. So, like, on a personal note, as an educator, there is an obligation on me to do some sort of CPD work and engage with educators that are actually working in this space as well. So, I mean, every country would have experts that are dealing with accessibility to education. And it's something that I know personally that we haven't really tapped into that, and it's something that we discussed at our table, that the idea of having those CPD points to engage with these organisations is something that we should be doing, because again, the whole ethos is education is the first experience of anti-doping, but how can you educate if you can't make it accessible, you know? Just a general comment there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that's so difficult because it will vary massively from impairment to impairment, and even from individual to individual within an impairment group. So I think that's possibly one of the reasons there isn't this all-encompassing CPD existing, because of those difficulties and because there are so many possible outcomes and possible variations. Getting to that stage would be amazing. I suppose that's a bit of a challenge on a number of us to see what we can do within that area. But yes, I think what we'll do then is we'll wrap it up. Hopefully I've caught us up a bit, Sam. Yeah, hopefully I've got us pretty close there to on time. So I will pass back to Ian to take on from there. So thanks very much, guys.